Hey everyone, I'm Chris. I serve as the lead pastor of Mill Creek Foursquare, and welcome to our podcast. This exists as an extension of the teaching ministry of our pastoral team. Here you're going to be able to find everything from Sunday messages to midweek communications, classes, interviews, conversations with friends. So we hope that you feel invited to participate in the life of our fellowship and receive of this ministry. Here you're going to be able to learn more about current events and much about the scriptures. So enjoy, relax, breathe, and ultimately may you be experiencing the presence of God. Our goal is to make disciples of Jesus who are experiencing His life, engaging in His presence, extending the gospel to their family, neighborhood, workplace, and world. So welcome and enjoy.
Hi there. Welcome to our midweek podcast here at Mill Creek Foursquare Church. I'm John. I'm here with Pastor Trevor.
What's going on?
And today we're going to begin a new sort of sub-series or subset within our larger midweek podcast project on the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. This will coincide with our new sermon series that will be starting soon, or I guess by the time this comes out, it will have already started, on the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And the title of the series is Rebuilders. It's focused on themes of rebuilding, renewal, restoration, a lot of kinds of words that crop up certainly in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah itself, but also might be worth us kind of reflecting on and thinking about in our own context and situation. So why don't we start off this episode and this whole sort of sub-series on Ezra and Nehemiah with just a little bit of conversation about why this series, why these books, what the focus might be. So Trevor, what will the focus of this series be? Why are we engaging with these particular parts of the biblical text? And why now, in particular, read these books?
Yeah, so I mean, at its core, we're asking one central question with this series. We're really proposing the question, what does it mean, or what does it look like to be one who rebuilds? Like, what does it look like to be one who is a rebuilder? That's why we didn't just name the series Rebuild or something along those lines, but we tried to choose almost an active word in the sense of rebuilders, that we're invited into the story to be one who is that. What does it look like you've already talked about, what does it look like to be one individually to rebuild our spiritual lives? What does it look like in our familial lives to rebuild, whether it be rhythms of worship, rhythms of generosity, all the above, and even the life of our community? What does it look like for us as a community to be one who rebuilds? And that's kind of the what of the series. Like, that's what we're going to be discussing, what we're going to be talking about through Ezra and Nehemiah, through a very critical juncture in our history as the people of God, as they came back from exile to rebuild the temple, and we'll talk more about that later, and the other structures as well. Yet, it's not just that, because we also situate the series within our own cultural moment. See, our own cultural moment, the deeper why for us is there seems to be, in the midst of our moment, a fresh optimism brewing. I mean, whether it be the elementary school across the street from we live across the street from elementary school in Kenmore, and this week, for the first time, we have kids playing. We can see them from our backyard. We have long lines that I have to wait on when I come home at the end of the day for parents to pick up their children, which is something I never realized until now. I guess I'll be there next year when Ephraim's in kindergarten. But there's a fresh out. Kids are going back to school. I mean, we've obviously seen the distribution of vaccines in the state of Washington. I mean, it's April. It'll probably be, this podcast will come after the fact, but vaccine distribution, where almost anyone in the state can get a vaccine as needed or as available, and all the above. They're just and even for Easter. I mean, I've been a part of this community for about a year now, or 18 months, and numerous staff who've been here for much longer than I have acknowledged that we have people who we haven't seen in 15 months, and that's not meant to be a judgment on people, but it's meant to be that people are coming back to in-person expressions of services, of participation. I mean, we just had 50 people go through Rooted, our small group track. I mean, we have people coming back in larger numbers. And so we're really asking the question at this kind of moment of optimism, at this moment of fresh hope, what does it look like for us as a community to rebuild together? Because we've already acknowledged this, but we aren't the community that we were before. That whatever we were before, COVID, global pandemic, we aren't that same community. And that's the same with us individually. Each of us individually, we are not, I would say, the same people in the sense that living in the midst of a global pandemic, no matter who you are, no matter how well, even if you're the most emotionally healthy, aware human of all time, this pandemic has affected you. You know, it has affected each of us. And there's something where we had a certain rhythm. Like I always felt like, and this was always the challenge, but even during shutdown orders and that kind of thing, I felt like, I don't know if your family felt like this, but I feel like we found a rhythm. Like we had this kind of rhythm of work and at home, and at least, and it was always towards the end, right? You know, right when things were reopening, like, dang it, we finally got a rhythm figured out or something. But coming back to in-person expressions of whether it be school, whether it be family life, community life, that does look different than the rhythm that we've been in. And so we want to really examine in this series, in the midst of our cultural moment, what we can learn from our own history as a people to say, how do we be one who rebuilds? Where do we even begin? You know, where do we begin to rebuild? And what can we learn from the stirring of the Spirit in our own history as a people? And so
we're thinking about rebuilding as a kind of metaphor, right? Like quite literally rebuilding would have to do with sort of constructing something, building something.
Oh yeah, I don't construct things, John. I don't build things with my hands. So we'd be in a lot of trouble if that were the case.
But what I hear you kind of getting at is that, you know, we've been through as a people, certainly in our sort of local and immediate community, but also obviously so many other communities and the church more broadly and globally. We've been through a season that has involved significant disruption in all kinds of ways. And so as we sort of envision what it might look like to come out of it to some extent, I mean, even that language is maybe a little bit difficult, right? Because who knows what exactly.
Well, yeah, and to acknowledge that as well, I think we're hitting on right there with coming out of it. What we're not saying is that the pandemic's over. We're not saying burn your masks, you know, throw it away. It's all over. We're moving on, right? But what we're saying, though, is there's a sense of hope right now. There's a sense of optimism, though we don't know what's going to happen in the future. Though the last 15 months, if anything, has shown us you don't know what the future holds, right? And so it's more so just embracing, though, that sense right now. And we all hit a point where we have to be one who, we as humans, there's certain things that we need. And there's certain things within the pandemic that have disrupted those needs, whether it be life in community, life in together. I mean, we've seen the rise of the exponential rise of something that was already taking place, but anxiety, depression, especially with technology and the means of disconnection that rises throughout that. And so it's not saying that those things are over, of course, because who knows, right? But it's more so just the invitation to saying no matter who you are, we are moving back into some sense of normalcy, whatever that normal is going to be. And that pace may be longer or slower than we expect, but at the same time, there is something brewing. I guess.
No, that's a great way to put it. And so, you know, anybody culturally here in the U.S. or globally might have a similar situation or a similar sense of like, okay, maybe certain things might be returning a little bit back to normal or some kind of newish normal or something like that. What is it now going to look like for me to sort of align myself with some kind of hope or explore what this might look like? But as the people of God who are shaped by, informed by the scriptures, I guess part of what it is that we're doing as a community is not just thinking about sort of what would it mean to have hope on sort of this side or at this point in our sort of processing of what we've been through, but also how might the scriptures inform what it looks like for us to be a people of hope? How might the scriptures inform what it looks like for us to be those who rebuild, restore, that kind of thing? And so that's what I hear you saying, is that maybe the logic of engaging with books like Ezra and Nehemiah at this point is that we're in this sort of moment culturally, and we can look to these texts that maybe narrate and explore similar kinds of dynamics that the people of God have kind of been involved in before.
Oh, totally, right? It's one of those invitations is saying we aren't coming up with something new. one sentiment I hear people share all the time is there's this sense of newness or novelty that we need to engage in as the people of God. And it's one of the most frustrating conversations to me personally, as a leader at least, is in one sense, obviously there are ever shifting realities, whether it be technology, whether it be what is the new normal. I know we all hate that phrase, the phrase that everyone hates, but that kind of idea, what is the new normal? Obviously there are things that are shifting, but at the core of our humanity, we're still human. And that's the place where the scriptures breathe life again and again from generation to generation, where each of us can read the scriptures and reflect and study them throughout our lives. And there's an enduring sense of relevance, and maybe not in the sense of relevance of how culture defines that or something, but in the sense of just an enduring, the scriptures put their finger on what it really means to be human. And they speak to the core needs that we have. And so stepping into like an Ezra and Nehemiah is just saying that there's a timelessness to this story. Now, the story may correct things that we don't expect, right? I mean, we have to interpret the story and make sense of it, and how do we apply it and all of those things. And we'll be talking about that more in the next episode. But yeah, there's really a timelessness that we're stepping into, and that there's some eternal principles that the story can teach us to say, what does it look like to be one who rebuilds on the good end of things? There are positive portrayals, but we're going to talk about in our next episode as well, negative portrayals too, that we learn from, that really make the book human in a lot of ways. It actually enters into the ambiguity of things. Now, as we step in, and so that's really the why of where we're going with the series. As we step into these books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and one thing should be noted is we're describing them as Ezra-Nehemiah. And I should explain that early on is, in our Bibles, in our English Bibles at least, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah are right next to each other. So they're back to back if you're reading your Bible reading plan or something. And they cover the same history. They cover about 100-year period of rebuilding. There's some gaps in there and such, but they cover this period. Though in the earliest manuscripts of Greek and Hebrew, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah were one story, one manuscript. And so we are going to be covering the books together as one unified story, in the sense of they're telling one unified story, and that's even the earliest reflections of the canon. That's what we see. And so that's one thing to identify. But before we even get into the book, there's so much we can say about Ezra and Nehemiah itself. We know there's an entire story that takes place before Ezra and Nehemiah, a story that we're stepping into, because really Ezra and Nehemiah finds itself towards the end of the Hebrew Bible, towards the end of the Old Testament story. And so to really set up this sense of hope, this sense of rebuilding, to really understand the hope deeply, you have to understand the story before it. And so, John, I'd love to hear if you could just set up, what are some of those threads that we need to understand as we step into Ezra and Nehemiah that take place beforehand to really help us understand this rebuilding efforts and this sense of hope?
Yeah. I mean, I'll just tell the whole story of the Old Testament in 5 minutes, like a Bible Project video.
There it is. Go for it. We might as well just play a video right now.
No, but I think it's an important question to help us kind of set things up, especially because broadly speaking, within a Christian framework, I think it's probably safe to say that the Old Testament often gets neglected. A lot of Christians sort of know what to do.
Wait, we need the Old Testament still, John?
Yeah. A lot of Christians, I think, sort of know what to do with the New Testament, or at least think they do. A lot of us have a sense of what's going on in the New Testament, how it informs Christian faith and discipleship and these kinds of things. The Old Testament can be a little bit more difficult. There are hermeneutical questions or sort of interpretive questions about how exactly Christians relate to the Old Testament. So, the Old Testament is somewhat neglected within Christian faith and sometimes misunderstood. And then even within the Old Testament, right? Like, what are the books that people tend to sort of gravitate toward or know what to do with? Maybe Genesis, maybe Exodus, maybe Isaiah, maybe the Psalms.
Yeah. After Leviticus, things kind of fall off.
Yeah.
Until about the Psalms.
Yeah. And so the Old Testament is somewhat neglected and misunderstood. Ezra and Nehemiah are probably some of the most neglected books within the Old Testament for Christians. And so, not only do we maybe not read these texts as often in a modern Christian frame of reference as certain other portions of the Bible, but also just how exactly they even fit within the story can sometimes be a little bit opaque or difficult for people to kind of have a sense of. I think one of the most helpful ways of thinking about how these these books or this one book. As you mentioned, there's a kind of, we'll probably refer to the text sort of interchangeably as two and also as one thing. But I think understanding something about the centrality of covenant in the Old Testament and the sort of dynamics of covenant relationship between God and God's people is important. And then understanding the degree to which the sort of catalytic and sort of catastrophic events of the exile in the 6th century, especially BC, how those factors sort of shape the entire biblical narrative is really important and really helpful. And I think can help us to get a handle on what's going on in Ezra and Nehemiah and why these books are concerned with the things they're concerned with, right? Because if we just open up Ezra and Nehemiah, we're kind of like, okay, we're learning about Persian kings, we're rebuilding some temple stuff, we're celebrating some festivals. There's lots of like letters from various people. Like it can be really confusing and overwhelming. But I think if we get a sense of what the primary concerns are and situate them within the larger storyline, that can be really helpful. So if we think back to sort of one of the earliest and most significant stages in sort of covenant relationship between God and people, if we think about the covenant between God and Abraham, this is a covenant that involved promises, and so because of promises, also hope and expectation associated with a land, associated with a people or descendants, and then associated with blessing. Both that God would bless this family that he was entering into covenant with, and that he would use them to be or become a blessing for all nations, for all families of the earth. And so those promises of sort of land and descendants and blessing begin from Genesis chapter 12 to kind of shape so much of the Old Testament narrative. When we then come to see God making a covenant, not just with an individual or with an individual family, but with this nation, what has now become the nation of Israel, again, we see that these themes of sort of a land and a people, and now a people with God's presence in their midst, and now a people who have been given the gift of God's law or guidance, this thing called Torah, and then eventually a people who have a king in their midst, who ideally would be someone that would facilitate the faithfulness of the covenant people, a king who would follow God's law or instruction and would facilitate the following of God's law or instruction within the wider community. All of these things become so central to the identity of the people of God, who are in covenant relationship with God, and to their sort of mission or self-understanding of what it means for them to be and exist as the people of God. So the crucial thing to recognize about the exile, which is, it's this one of the central sort of events in the Old Testament narrative. You can read about it in the books of Kings, and there are references to it throughout the prophets. But one of the most important things to recognize about it, I think, is that it involves a significant disruption of all of these things that were central to covenant relationship and to the identity of God's covenant people.
Yeah.
Right?
So it was a disruption of everything, all of those threads you just hit on.
Yeah.
This basically
exactly.
was a breaking point of disrupting all of those things.
Yeah. Yeah. And we see language in the prophets, for example, of God sort of speaking about, the exile is understood in the Old Testament as a form of divine judgment, but not just because God was like, I'm done with this covenant thing, I'm going to break it off. Rather, over and over, it's this notion that the people have already broken the covenant repeatedly. Yeah. And so the exile is sort of the coming to fruition of the appropriate judgment for that reality. But the crucial thing to recognize about what exile involves is it's forced deportation. So it involves the loss of land through the people being conquered first by Assyria and then by Babylon and being deported and relocated in various ways. So a loss of the promised land. There's the loss of the temple, which is eventually destroyed by the Babylonians in the 6th century BC. There's a disruption of the Davidic monarchy, or the line of David, where there was a king on the throne within this specific line who ideally would be the kind of king who's, a man after God's own heart and facilitates the observance of God's law within the community. So all of these sort of central components to what it means to be God's covenant people, and the entire sense of identity and mission for the people of Israel are disrupted and called into question in the context of the exile. So when we then turn to books like Ezra and Nehemiah, as strange and confusing as they might be, and as much as we might have a hard time as sort of modern Christian readers relating to some of the concerns that we immediately see, if we just notice that, okay, there's a concern with returning to the land here, that seems to be really significant for the sort of covenantal identity of these people. There's a concern for rebuilding temple as the space within which the people of God understand God, their covenant partner, God, to be present in their midst. There's at least sort of hints toward the restoration of things like rulers that come from the line of David, and also priests associated with sort of what things had been like. And so when we begin to see this sort of emphasis on rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the city, reestablishing structures of worship and festivals that have been those things that form these covenant people in the past, when we begin to see these kinds of things take on prominent roles in Ezra and Nehemiah, we can see how it fits within this larger narrative where those things were a reality at first for the covenant people. They were lost or disrupted, and then all kinds of questions were raised about whether any of these things would sort of come back into the center of what it means for Israel to be Israel. And then in Ezra and Nehemiah, there is at least a sense that maybe we're on the cusp of some of these things being restored, rebuilt, reinstituted, that sort of thing.
I find that, so two things you said there. One, you kept using the word identity, and I find that disruption of identity to be so, I actually think it makes the book quite relatable.
Totally.
In the sense of what's foreign to us is what those identity markers for the people of God were.
Yeah.
So like we don't necessarily associate our identity with, the temple that held the very presence of God. Though we do, I mean, obviously Jesus is the new temple, like that's the theological point, or we are temples of the Holy Spirit. So it's maybe more of a people than a physical place per se. But I do think the identity markers of whether it be the temple, whether it be Jerusalem and the city, whether it be the lineage of the monarchy, obviously it's related to not just their identity, but also their mission and purposes of God and the promises of God to bless the world. But I find that disruption of identity to be something that we actually can understand. And secondly, that disruption of rhythm as well is something you're hitting on too, is the temple, for example, had a rhythm, right? It had festivals. It actually it set the calendar for the people of God. I mean, you think of even the New Testament, you think of Acts and you think of Pentecost or something. Like these things are taking place, right, in Jerusalem at a place. And so when those things are disrupted, I think it's relatable in the sense of, even when I think of like COVID-19, I think of last year, it's nowhere near the same disruptions we talk about, in the sense of a people who've been deported, who've been forced from their homes, who've been forced from everything they've ever known and loved into a foreign kind of pagan land, all the above. Like it's kind of apples and oranges, obviously. But that sense of even the disruption of rhythm, I think is quite relatable, right? In that sense of we understand of having to, whether it be working from home versus going to the office, there's some threads there. I mean, think of the disruption of our family life. I mean, kids not going to school. I mean, I have young kids, you have kids, your kids were in school, so you'd understand this more than I would. But that sense of disruption, we all see how much that threw our lives off. Kids staring at computers all day or something, and all the above. But that, anyways, I guess I'm just, those threads of disruption of identity and rhythm make the book actually quite relatable when you start to get into it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think obviously you're correct, and it's helpful to make sure, we can point to elements of overlap or correlation between our own situation and that of the ancient Israelite people. Obviously, there are also significant differences.
Our homes weren't burnt down and pillaged.
Yeah, and I think that's appropriate. But I also think it's appropriate for us to sort of take seriously how, if we think about any one specific element of our life or existence or realities that we thought of as normal that were disrupted in this last year, or were challenged, or that we were prompted to kind of rethink or reconsider, or that we just sort of lost in some way. Any one thing on its own, you can easily kind of say, it's a relatively minor thing. But I think probably most of us can have a sense of there is this sort of cumulative effect to what this last year, or roughly a year, has brought about that really does. If you think of it only in terms of specific practices, specific opportunities, specific rhythms, that kind of thing, you can maybe sort of marginalize the significance of each thing. But the cumulative effect really does cause people, I think, and has caused many of us to kind of rethink elements of identity, purpose, mission. Even the terminology of sort of having an existential crisis is probably not that far off from what a lot of individuals have experienced, and then a lot of people communally have kind of engaged in because of sort of what's happened.
Yeah, it's almost, it's interesting to think about that, because it's, for the people of God, when we went through Ezra and Nehemiah, it's almost like, we've kind of felt like all of those little things adding up, but in the people of God, it's everything you can imagine, almost all at once.
Yeah.
In the sense of every identity marker or basic rhythm you understood as a people, and those threads that you hit on that really articulated well throughout the whole, from Abraham and even before that, all the way through the biblical story. If all of those got disrupted, that's the story we're entering into in Ezra and Nehemiah. It's the story of how do you rebuild when everything you've known, how do you rebuild from the ashes in a way? How do you rebuild from the ground up? Would that be correct?
Yeah, I think so. And I think probably the one other thing to say is that, and we'll, like you've said, in the next episode, we'll maybe get into some of the tensions and ambiguities in the book. But even if we think about the Old Testament narrative as a whole, or Christian faith as a whole, there's a sense in which going through any kind of experience of sort of significant disruption or crisis, and then looking toward something like hope or rebuilding on the other side of that, I think we need to take seriously that you referenced earlier that a lot of us don't really love this idea of a new normal. Like what do we even mean by that? Or even language like back to normal, which I think it rolls off of our tongues a lot, but a lot of us are sort of uncomfortable with it. Like, what does that even mean? Is that even possible?
Cautious. I think there's a cautious
piece.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think as we engage in these conversations on the podcast, as we explore these texts in our sermon series, and as we sort of seek to hear from the Lord during this season through God's Word, I think personally it'll be really important for us to take seriously that part of what it means to be rebuilders is to recognize that maybe some things genuinely do need to die and not be resurrected, while some things do need to be reinstituted.
Yeah.
Maybe some rhythms were really positive and did cultivate healthy Christian community, and so it would be wonderful to kind of explore what it would look like to re-engage in those. And maybe some rhythms really were not contributing to the health of who we are as the people of God, and so need to be. And so maybe the disruption is an opportunity to explore different rhythms, or in certain ways and in certain aspects of who we are as the people of God.
Oh, totally. There is definitely that. There's a reevaluation that does need to take place,
it's a good
because
word
there's a refining, right? There's a refining of who we were and who we are now. And to say that hasn't changed would be the word for it? Would be naive at best, in the sense of, or maybe it would be pressing down and ignoring the transition that you've been through. Right? Because any people who've been through a traumatic event, I mean, we talk about the people of God, but we're talking about now about even 21st century. When you go through a traumatic event, it does change you, right? Yes, hopefully you work through it, you lament, you have a healthy process for how you express emotion, you go to God, you go to community, all the above. But on the other side of that, you're not the same person.
Yeah.
And I think, and that's where even the community, we're not the same community. And that's one thing I said, articulate at the beginning of this. It makes me think of Ezra 3, right? In that story of Ezra 3, and we won't camp down too much here, but I think of the Ezra 3 when they reconstruct the temple. And there's just this story, and you're going to be preaching, you probably will preach on this by the time this episode comes out. And but it's such a muddied picture, right? Because you see in Ezra 3, they rebuilt the temple. There's this moment of great rejoicing taking place. Yet you see, but many of the priests, Ezra 3, verse 12, but many of the priests and Levites and heads of the father's houses, old men who had seen the first house, so they'd seen the first temple, right? They'd been around in the extravagance of the first temple pre-exile. It said, wept with a loud voice when they saw the foundation of this house being laid, though many shouted aloud for joy, so that the people could not distinguish the sound of the joyful shout from the sound of the people's weeping, for the people shouted with great joy, and the sound was heard far away. And you enter into this picture of just this identity crisis almost of the people. There's certain people who are rejoicing. There's rejoicing, the foundation of the temple, the place where heaven met earth, where the very presence of God was among the people of God, is being laid. Yet there's also a tension in the story, that this thing that they're laying is not what it once was. And to go through that and the trauma of this, there's a letting go of almost an ending. It feels like an ending in some ways. And yes, every ending is an invitation to a new beginning, but there's a tension here. And I think that's what you're hitting on in some ways, is that whatever once was is not the reality of where we are now. And there is something to have to let go and let that ending receive into a new place, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I wonder if even our we've said a number of things today about aspects of sort of, the pandemic we've been talking about, the experience and the crisis that it has brought about has been a global phenomenon, obviously. And things that have occurred and are occurring and might soon occur within our culture are sort of these things that we share broadly. But even if we think very specifically about our own particular church community, you mentioned earlier just talking to people about what an emotional experience it's been like to sort of see people coming back to church. But there's also a somewhat, there's a more complex picture, I think, in the journey that our church has been on, our particular community of faith, than just, people weren't here for a while and now people are back, and that's beautiful and wonderful. That's a component of it. But there's also folks that have left our community who aren't coming back. And there's also lots of new folks and new faces and families, and so I wouldn't want to sort of overemphasize or overstate the sort of correspondence between sort of we're in the exact same situation as the people we meet on the pages of Ezra and Nehemiah. Yeah. But I do think there's some really, in light of that Ezra 3 portion that you just read from and spoke about, I think there are some really interesting elements of overlap where we are a much more complex community of faith than just one that sort of couldn't meet together for a while and is now meeting together again. There are folks that were part of our community who are not. There are folks who have recently become part of our community. There are some of us who probably do look back to sort of how things were and would like to see it just be kind of that way again. Yeah. And I think there are those among us who have a sense of what could be in terms of a new kind of future for our community. And there are probably people, many of us, who sort of feel some tension between those things. And so I think that, reflecting on passages like that and portions of these books that sort of invite us into that tension could be really helpful for us to kind of explore, like, why is it that some of these folks were sort of celebrating and others were weeping right alongside them? What is it about this move toward restoration and rebuilding that is sort of that seems to involve a dynamic of fulfillment and restoration, but then there's also a more sort of complicated dynamic as well.
It's tension, right? The tension of the human experience, tension of change, right? And in this last 15 months has necessitated change. It's not one that people, sometimes you have changes where you opt into the change, or something like I signed up for this new diet and I'm going to be doing it or something, where this is one that was forced on everyone, no matter who you were, to enter into. But that thread you're hitting on, though, even the complexity of the situation in our own community. And this is when we dialogue with pastors and other ministry leaders, this is every church in the country, no matter what church you are. You've had people leaving and you had people coming, right? Sure. And there's been that flow. So it's not just Mill Creek Foursquare or something, but all the above. I had we had a couple for dinner a few weeks ago, and we were talking, and they've been a part of our community for a long time, but they hadn't been coming because of kids and family and all the above, which totally made sense. And they'd simply ask me, will we know anyone? And that question really struck me, because I realized that, and to me, obviously, I've only been part of the community for 12 to 18 months, so I'm like, I don't know who you knew before. I didn't know anyone. Yeah. But that question, I think, really articulates what the tension of what you're talking about that we're entering into is a tension of what once was and who we are now. And there's a complex picture, and the complex picture is going to raise a complexity of emotions and a complexity of processing, where some will rejoice to who we are now, whereas others will lament. And to be able to properly enter into that and process that becomes very important. And I actually think I've heard you talk about this previously as well. Maybe we could end the episode with this, because I think this is a tangible practice. Because it does raise a question, what do you do, right? In the sense of, because you'll find yourselves on multiple ends of the spectrum, but especially people who've felt more of the sense of disruption towards lament maybe, or towards a saddening over maybe what once was. I guess the question I have is, what do we process, or how do we process that? And I think one thing I've heard you talk a lot about before is even the practice of lament, or what lament does, even though I've read some of your writings as well. Could you even introduce us to the sense of, like, what is lament, and why does lament matter for the Christian life?
Yeah. Well, yeah, lament is, one way to think about it is that it's a form of sort of vocalized or even embodied kind of honesty before God. And probably honesty to oneself and one's community when experiencing or having experienced some acute degree of suffering or difficulty of some sort. It's when we see lament being practiced or expressed within the Bible, it is sometimes something that's vocalized, but there are sometimes very bodily practices associated with it, right? Probably many of us
like sackcloth or
have,
something.
at least in the back of our minds. Yeah, I think I remember a few narratives where people ended up putting on this sackcloth thing and covering themselves with ashes and doing some strange sort of rituals. But I think what we see people doing there is choosing to sort of engage in and actually process in verbal and bodily kinds of ways, or embodied kinds of ways, the pain and the trauma that they're going through. I don't know very much about psychology or therapy or how to understand sort of trauma and
you're good. Stay in your lane, John.
Processing. But I think I know enough just vaguely from living and from listening to people who do know about these things to know that would be sort of, probably an element of therapy 101 or trauma 101, is that sort of one of the least healthy things we could do is try to avoid or suppress or not process those kinds of things. Yeah. And instead, what one needs to do is sort of face, try to understand, and try to sort of process or kind of walk through the trauma that one has experienced or the suffering that one is going through. And so I think that there's a sense in which part of what lament does in the Bible, and part of what lament does for people who are in relationship to God, is it sort of invites us to engage in precisely those kinds of vocalizations and practices. And it reminds us that God is not sort of, waiting for us to just figure out our like despair and trauma stuff and then just come to him with our celebration, but rather that what it means to be a worshiper of God, what it means to be honest before God, is to bring every aspect of who we are to God. And that will sometimes involve praise and celebration and thanksgiving, and it will sometimes involve lament and confession and honest, like despairing questions and that kind of thing.
Well, and you think of it, even Jesus. I mean, I think of Jesus in the garden, right? And he's just laying it bare before the Father. And that's like a picture of, he wasn't entering in there saying joyfully, let's worship, I'm about to be crucified. Yeah. Like there was a sense of just a deep, maybe lament may not be the right word in that situation, but a deep confession, a deep pain of kind of giving things over, his feelings, his will, his desires, and ultimately his trust. Yeah. Right? Because lament ultimately says, I give the keys of trust back to you, God, in the sense of, And I think you're hitting on something important that, I heard one author say that what you don't transform, you transmit. And there's something to lament invites us to transform things, because if you don't lament, if you don't allow yourself to process, those things seep out of you. I found that in my own life. When we closed the church, my counselor brought me through a long season of lament. And actually he decided to double down on the church with my dad had passed away 10 years before. And he decided to double down on that and say, well, actually, I don't think you totally lamented your father's passing. And I was like, so you want to do double whammy? But there was something to that though, where even my father's passing, I had not fully lamented. And there was something that I was transmitting into others. I was projecting onto others, to my wife, to my kids, all the above, that I had never fully realized. And until I actually entered into a deep lament, which was painful. I mean, it was months of just like weeping, of crying before the Lord. Yet on the other side of it, that transformation comes through that actually when you come in honesty before God, even in tears and in pain, there's something on the other side of it, but we just don't always have that vision in the moment to say, because we just can't see it, right? Your vision almost gets truncated in the moment, but it is that place of getting your feelings and ultimately your trust to God and saying, God, I trust you that on the other side of this, you have restoration, you have renewal, there's something good on the other side of this, but I have to trust you in the midst of that.
Yeah. So, as we step into these books as a congregation and explore what they might reveal to us, what they might speak to us, what God's Spirit might say to us, and also sort of shape in us, so to speak, in and through this season, maybe actually just exposing ourselves to and sort of learning to be comfortable with a degree of tension will be helpful. I mean, certainly in the midst of a year like 2020, or even in the immediate sort of aftermath of it early on in 2021, there's lots of places in the scriptures we could go. We could go to something like Lamentations and just be like, well, this has been really hard. Let's just sort of, I don't want to say wallow in that, but but let's just, and I think that there would be an appropriateness to that, and that's valid. On the opposite extreme, perhaps we could go to some of the more uplifting and encouraging songs
here,
or something like that, and just focus on sort of the hope that we have for the future. And again, I think there would certainly be validity to that. I think maybe part of what Ezra and Nehemiah have to offer us in this season is something just a little bit more complicated than full-blown lament or full-blown hope. A sense of what it might look like for God to restore and for us to be part of this restoration and rebuilding process, but in a way that might be a little bit more complicated than we might initially assume.
And to close with this, I think what you're identifying is what it means to be human.
Sure.
And I think that's where the hope of Ezra and Nehemiah lies, in the sense that it enters us into a story that is in tension, and that makes it relatable. There are leaders in tension, the community's in tension, and there are things that don't meet their expectations. There are things we'll talk more about next time. There are things that meet prophetic fulfillment, and there's things that it seems like the prophetic fulfillment is delayed. That it's actually, you read the end of the book and you go, oh, this was not the full fulfillment of all of these threads of God's promises that we've been awaiting or seeking. And so it enters us into a story that is thoroughly human and then actually is very relatable, I would say, to us.
Yeah, it's a great way to put it. Well, in the next couple episodes, we will press into a little bit more detail with regard to how these books fit within the larger Old Testament storyline and maybe even the entire biblical narrative. And we'll get into a little bit more detail about what kinds of themes and ideas are contained within these books themselves. But we'll sign off for now. Thanks for listening. This episode has been produced by Dave Sproul. It's been edited by Tim Machira, and we had music from Sherry Machira.
Thank you for joining us, and should you want more information or to engage with us further, please go to mc4us.org for more.